This is Mexico. In terms of geopolitics, it receives relatively little attention. Most of it gets pigeonholed into US politics, as it relates to migration and the border. However, Mexico is quietly becoming a key piece on the cliched chessboard of international conflict. And that is why seemingly innocent messages of congratulations, and their subsequent warmly accepted replies, are drawing so much concern in the West. But we will get to that later. For now, this is the story of how Mexico quietly became a critical component in emergency US defense planning, but one that has not actually been integrated into the system. Yet. Prologue. Just-in-time military production. The beginning of our saga lies in an active US decision to switch to a bare-bones strategy. Broadly, you can orient your defense industry to have massive latent capacity, say, multiple factories that all produce the same or very similar goods, with tons of redundancies and ample unused excess capacity. Alternatively, you can pare down your facilities so that production capacity exactly matches what your orders demand, hence the just-in-time moniker. That latter option is indeed what the United States does today, and has done for decades now. But it was not always like this. During the Cold War, under the threat of the Soviet Union, the West leaned toward the former strategy. Tons of defense contractors, in overlapping roles, and an abundance of excess capacity. But post-Cold War, defense contractors consolidated, as the West shifted toward the just-in-time philosophy. This decision has received ample criticism in light of the shortages experienced during the Russia-Ukraine war, particularly regarding donations of 155mm artillery shells. However, that criticism largely misses the point. Spare capacity is incredibly expensive to maintain. Thus, keeping them means higher taxes and a greater burden on the civilian sector. The end consequence is slower economic growth. That is why administration after administration after administration kept the policy. Moreover, it was the whole idea behind the peace dividend that the West enjoyed with the fall of the Soviet Union. But this was not just a matter of short-term wealth creation. The key here is that modern military power is largely a function of economic power. The more money that you have, the more military might you can ultimately wield. Thus, excess production capacity is useful for maximizing short-term power, but it is a bad idea for maintaining long-term power. The trick, of course, is flipping the switch to ramp up production when it becomes necessary. This was the pathway to victory for the United States during World War II. In 1939, US military spending was just $31 billion inflation-adjusted dollars. Despite its participation in World War I, this was still an era of American isolationism, and silly political cartoons promoting the policy. It helped that America was flanked by the deterrent power of both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Keep that in mind for later. Thus, Washington viewed substantial investment in the US military as a waste of money. But then another world war broke out in Europe. Washington grew nervous, and indeed, eventually the war came home when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. That convinced the United States to get to work. By 1945, US military spending exploded to $1.49 trillion. By comparison, US military spending in 2023 was just $856 billion. Still a lot, but remember that the US economy is more than 10 times bigger today. This plan worked in part because of the ample existing civilian industry that the United States had on its soil. You see, the expertise to build cars and such was not that far off from producing tanks and planes. So they shifted over, like at this Ford Motor Company plant, where they ditched the standard 4 wheels for the wings of a B-24 Liberator. 6,972 units later, the Ford plant had done its part in making the United States become a military juggernaut, and the Allies won the war. Back in the present, the United States is left to confront a pair of different adversaries. One, ironically, is a resurgent Russia, the heir of the Soviet legacy, and former reason that had previously caused the United States to over-prepare for war. The other is China, long seen as a looming threat within Washington. The U.S. national security strategy did not fully reorient to China until the Trump administration, only for the war in Ukraine to ping-pong the main focus back to Moscow, at least based on the headlines. Indeed, efforts to aid Kyiv have shown major deficiencies in the West's industrial arms capacity. Take the aforementioned 155mm artillery shell. Ask any Ukrainian. These are the most in-demand round. Due to an under-provision, though, Ukraine has gone extended periods firing only 2,000 total artillery shells per day. Russia, meanwhile, is up to 10,000 daily of its equivalent artillery shell. This is a main reason why the frontline movement went from looking okay for Ukraine last year to exclusively shifting favorably for Russia over the last 7 months. The big problem here was less the just-in-time philosophy, and more that the West was slow to spin up production, well after it became apparent that an expansion was necessary. Meanwhile, the $61 billion aid bill from Congress in April will only address a fraction of the problem, and the more recent $50 billion loan will not do much here either, as that is not meant for American infrastructure expansion. Keep in mind, though, that this is not the United States' war. Washington is merely acting as an arms supplier for a third-party combatant. Still, all told, what we are observing in real time are some fundamental limits to what the United States is capable of producing, even if places like the Army ammunition plant in Scranton are experiencing a surge. That, in turn, raises concerns about what would happen should the United States find itself in a full-scale war against one of those two opponents. To put some more structure on the problem, imagine that Russia is successful in capturing Ukraine, and then it turns its attention to the invasion of a NATO ally in Europe. Alternatively, suppose that China attempts a 3-day special landing operation on Taiwan, only to see itself get bogged down in a protracted war that extends to the other US allies in the region. Either way, the United States may find itself in a long-term, all-in industrial fight against a capable adversary. And then what? Well, what should happen next, emphasis on should, is a repeat of World War II. The United States turns to its industrial partners, builds up the military strength that it let lay fallow for 35 years, and then blazes on to victory. In fact, the legal framework for that still exists, and you have likely already heard of it. In 1950, with the Korean War starting, the United States passed the Defense Production Act. This permits the White House to use the force, of law that is, to compel U.S. companies to work with the federal government in times of crisis. The reason it may sound familiar is due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In the middle of that chaos, the Trump administration invoked the Defense Production Act to accelerate the manufacturing of ventilators and other life-saving equipment. In the future, though, the threats might not be so microscopic. But still, the Truman-era legislation provides an apparent answer. If only life would be so simple for the United States. The reality is that such a solution is no longer available. On the bureaucracy side, civilian defense production oversight got passed along through a number of different agencies over the years, before finally becoming a part of FEMA. That would be the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which its flag is so helpful to highlight. Then, as if to underscore the earlier point about the United States letting defense production wither, FEMA basically stopped caring about geopolitical issues after the Cold War ended, and narrowed its focus to natural disaster response, to the point that anyone under the age of 40 likely has no memory of its original intentions. Take a look at its headquarters. Even its motto gives it away: helping people before, during, and after disasters. China? Russia? Good luck. On the manufacturing side of things, it is not much better. The issue here is that the United States is no longer the active industrial powerhouse it once was. Active being the critical word here. Hold that thought for a moment. Take Pittsburgh as a microcosm for the problem. In 1950, the city peaked at a population of 677,000 people, It was, at one point, an economic powerhouse in manufacturing and the steel industry, and the home of the likes of Andrew Carnegie. It was of so much importance that it was once thought to be one of the Soviet Union's main targets in the event of a major nuclear exchange, with about half of those yinzers expected to die in the process. But then American manufacturing and steel became relatively uncompetitive on the global market. In fact, the United States became a net importer of steel in 1959, and the rise of world trade meant that those former titans of industry soon found themselves struggling to stay financially afloat. As a result, Pittsburgh hemorrhaged population down to 303,000. Forget Soviet nukes. The underlying economic shifts removed the same number of people from the city. But like I said, Pittsburgh is a microcosm for the entire shift in American economic priorities. Now it is a hub for education, the medical industry, and technology development, from self-driving Ubers to Google Shopping and the metaverse. Meanwhile, US Steel, once upon a time the largest corporation in the entire world, and the pride of Andrew Carnegie's fortune, well, it is soon to become part of Nippon Steel. I say soon because there is bipartisan criticism of the acquisition, based on this video's general theme of self-reliance. Is it a good idea to outsource steelmaking, given how vital it is to a war effort? But with that said, the deal does seem likely to happen. To tie a bow on that, you see this tallest building in the skyline? That is the US Steel Tower, but note that it now bears UPMC signage at the top. In any case, the transition has worked well for Pittsburgh. In 2009, Obama chose the city to host a G20 summit to showcase its rebirth. And while that is great for everyone who has found employment there, and same for everyone in support industries, expertise in virtual reality will not do enough to sway the metallic reality of war. Of course, the United States still has some industry. It's not like it all went elsewhere. But it is not at the same scale that it once was. In 1979, 19.5 million Americans worked in manufacturing jobs. By 2024, that number dropped to 13 million. The difference is starker when you consider that there were only 220 million Americans in 1979, whereas there are 342 million today. The situation is not hopeless for the United States, though. There is a way to solve the problem. Again, part of this is to take baby steps now to increase production. But the $61 billion is only going to cover part of the new normal, not create excess capacity. And the reality of the matter is that there is just no political consensus to expand to that extent. Not with the current Congress, anyway. The upshot for the United States is that manufacturing knowledge has not completely disappeared. In the long run, Americans are perfectly capable of expanding weapons production to the point of winning a long war, once Washington decides to pull the trigger. The rub is finding a way to bridge the gap from the now to that long game. The solution there is to look to countries that have expanded their manufacturing footprints, basically the places where the US jobs were outsourced to. Obviously, when it comes to outsourced jobs, China is the first place that you would think of. But something tells me that Beijing will not be too excited to produce US tanks that will go on to fight Chinese soldiers. Same goes for if the war were against Russia, even if it is a slightly less absurd idea. India and Vietnam are two more countries that come to mind, but Vietnam is not yet a significant partner of the United States, despite the first steps down that path, and in a twist is about to receive a visit from Putin. Meanwhile, India is in a direct partnership with Russia under BRICS. You can judge a little bit of India's priorities by looking at where the Russian oil has gone during the current war. Regardless, even US partners in the region have the inherent problem of being too close to China, and thus are risky choices if you want to protect the critical facilities. It would be nice if there were another manufacturer protected by a Pacific and Atlantic Ocean. Well, there is. It's Mexico. Following the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement, many of the US manufacturing jobs went south, where labor was cheaper. This includes the key automotive industry, with Mexico becoming a car production hub. And even if we are not talking about the finished car itself, many of the components that go into a car produced in Detroit are first produced in Mexico. For example, Ford constructs some of its engines at this plant in Chihuahua. On the grand scheme of things, this is helpful for business mobilization. Yes, it is Mexico, but the corporate entity is still American, meaning that the corporate knowledge for that manufacturing is also still American. Better that than a Chinese car company taking over market share. What's more, in a twist of irony, many of the other manufacturing jobs that went to China have since run into a problem. China now has money. That has raised the wages of Chinese manufacturing workers, causing another round of outsourcing, some of which also to Mexico. The total consequence of all of this is that Mexico now has 13.8 million manufacturing jobs, compared to a population of 129 million. That means more than 10% of the country works in the sector. By comparison, there are more manufacturers in Mexico than in the United States, despite the latter's substantially larger population. The percentages aren't even close. The one slight detail, of course, is convincing Mexico to help out in this capacity, which is not a guarantee. Another irony of all of those manufacturing jobs going south is that Mexico now has strong economic ties with the United States. That serves as a starting point. However, relations between the two countries have been contentious in recent years. Now, to be clear, they are not hostile. No one is about to repeat the 1847 occupation of Mexico City. It is also humorous to think about how Mexico City would respond to a modern-day Zimmerman telegram. Perhaps a Zimmerman TikTok? Or perhaps a Zimmerman telegram. Anyway, in the event of a war, the United States will not be asking Mexican plants to switch to weapons manufacturing out of the goodness of their hearts. Rather, the United States will be paying for that convenience. I'm sure it would be nice for Washington if Mexico built something for the United States, and the United States could somehow convince Mexico to pay for it. But that is not how this will work. The question for Mexico is whether it wants to disrupt its relationship with Moscow or Beijing to participate in US weapons production. And that is why this tweet raised so many eyebrows. Now, to be clear, it is not like this tweet was unique. It was part of the boilerplate thanks distributed to everyone, twice to the United States even, and once to Zelensky, with Maduro thrown in for some balance. Indeed, in practice, Mexico does not have much of an economic relationship with Russia. Meanwhile, Mexico has mostly voted in the United Nations along with the Western Bloc on questions regarding the Ukraine war, though Mexico was a notable non-signatory of the latest multilateral declaration. Still, put differently, if Russia were to advance further into Europe, Mexico, at a minimum, would be willing to hear US proposals. China, on the other hand, is more complicated. Mexico has a substantial trade relationship with it, and in recent years, China has been flooding investment money abajo. Thus, on the surface, it might seem that Mexico would think twice about doing something that would damage that relationship. But the situation is more convoluted than that. Part of the reason that Mexico is getting all of that investment is because of the Trump administration's tariffs against China. Combined with the NAFTA 2.0 agreement, Chinese companies have found a loophole. Outsource those companies' manufacturing to Mexico under Mexican tariff law, and then export those goods to the United States tariff-free. So what appears to be Chinese investment in Mexico is actually just a way to get around Trump-era taxes. Better than the alternative for China, great for Mexico because it gets the jobs and the taxes, and really bad for the policy outcome that the United States was trying to induce. Regardless, if the United States and China were to get involved in a full-scale war, presumably all of that trade would dry up anyway. Sorry, Blinken, no more searching for vinyl in Beijing, or watching some hoops in Shanghai. In any case, with that trade gone, there may not be much of a trade-off for Mexico here. Overall, though, the general problem means that Washington cannot take its relationship with Mexico City for granted. Not if it wants sufficient things that go boom, anyway. Its southern partner may just be the linchpin if the United States ever finds itself in a full-scale war across the globe. But for now, it's just full-scale war in Eastern Europe. If you want to learn more about that war, these books are a great starting point. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. One of the sillier things about publishing is how much a title determines whether a video gets watched. These two options are the exact same video, and in fact, the one that you are currently watching. But there is a clear preference among viewers. Here's hoping that first title paid off.